Oliver, you're a constructive theologian. You do quite a lot in philosophical theology. You're one of the leading kind of authors in terms of analytic theology. What led you to Edwards? What was your interest? What did you see in him?
I think my interest in Edwards predates my interest in philosophy and therefore in analytic theology by some time. Actually, I started reading Edwards when I went up to university as an undergraduate and was sort of captivated by his vision of the world, I think, his way of thinking theologically about everything, his being, as often been said, a God-intoxicated theist and seeing the world through this kind of theological lens. And so the Edwards part comes first, really, and quite a lot earlier, and then I couldn't shake Edwards off. The further I went in my studies, the more I kept coming back to Edwards. But I think probably to some extent, working with Edwards led me to the more philosophical side of theology. And so I found myself moving from thinking theologically about a number of the sorts of topics that Edwards does to wondering about what underpins them philosophically, and that led me to think maybe I should read some philosophy as well. That's a short version of a very long journey that ultimately ended up with me working in at the kind of interface between philosophy and theology, which is the place where analytic theology started out, I suppose. So it's been an interesting journey, but it's certainly true that Edwards was very much part of that. It wasn't incidental to that. And engaging with someone like Edwards, who's kind of an analytic theologian before analytic theology in some ways. I mean, he's very analytical in the way he approaches theological topics, as you know, very careful in parsing out distinctions and making clear things that he wants to say. He doesn't seem to waste any words in the way in which he puts things together. But also the sorts of topics he's interested in are right at this kind of intersection between philosophy and theology, trying to figure out, why would God create the world? What's God's nature like? What does it mean to say that God is triune, and so on and so forth. So he's been an interesting interlocutor for me for some of those reasons, I think. George, you've engaged with Edwards from a slightly different perspective, from the more historical perspective, and spent, 5 or 6 years writing a massive biography of Edwards that's now the sort of standard Jonathan Edwards life, and then later went back and wrote a second, shorter life that's entirely distinct from the first one on Edwards, with much more to do with, Ben Franklin and other things. What led you as a historian to think it would be a good idea to spend that much time with this particular early modern thinker?
I discovered Edwards when I was in graduate school. I had a very strong Reformed upbringing as an Orthodox Presbyterian, and after college I went to Westminster Seminary in Philadelphia for a year to find out more about the theological tradition that I was part of, sort of work out some issues I had about the faith. But Edwards was not really on the radar among many Reformed people at that time. Edwards came up in the history course, but not in the theology courses. And then at graduate school, I discovered Edwards, and what attracted me was this is really a wonderful vision of the dynamics of Reformed theology, and particularly I have a very clear sense of picking up the idea of beauty as the center of how God is part of, God's communicating and responding to us and drawing us into an idea of beauty and love as the center of reality, that's radiating out from God, and that's a dynamic vision of what can be a rather theoretical kind of idea of the sovereignty of God. It's kind of an abstraction, but this is the idea of God as acting, and the response has to be an effective kind of response. So personally, I really learned from Edwards And then I would teach about Edwards a little bit, not as a course, but in passing at least, that was on my radar. And then the opportunity came to write a big biography of Edwards for the Yale series, for Yale Press, on the anniversary of the 300th anniversary of his birth. And that was a wonderful opportunity. So I jumped at the chance. I had already committed to Erdman's to write a shorter biography of Edwards. So I wrote the big one with the understanding I would then go back and write the other one. So it was a wonderful opportunity for me, and I was glad to spend what turned out to be maybe 10 years on the two books, and that was a really edifying kind of project for me. So, Kyle, I guess you're...
You're up next, Kyle. Why your work on Edwards is really at the forefront of what I think of as the new sort of constructive work that's being done on Edwards, where, George has already mentioned this, that Edwards is often, until relatively recently, been seen as a kind of figure in the history books that people might want to be interested in if they're interested in the historical dimension. But there's now this kind of turn to bringing Edwards back into the theological conversation as a dialogue partner. Your work is very much part of that. What drew you to Edwards?
Well, my journey is almost the opposite of yours in one real sense, is that I had a real interest in Reformed theology. I went to Aberdeen to do a systematic theological piece. So that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to do my PhD in systematics, and I was actually searching for someone to do it on. I didn't go there to do Edwards. And it was, interestingly enough, my supervisor, a Bonhoeffer scholar, said, "Have you thought about Edwards?" And my response was, "No." And why are you suggesting him? And it was interesting that he thought of Edwards. He said, "Kyle, I know you have this particular interest in how theology and spirituality are one thing, not two." It's almost how Edwards led you into this kind of recognition that there's this real profound analytic way that theology can be done. I came in with an instinct that theology should always be spiritual, that spirituality should always be deeply theological, and that we used to know that and we have now forgotten it. And I got into Edwards really that way. My own work, when I probably first landed on Edwards, my thought was, well, maybe I'll do something on sanctification or something a little closer to what I eventually later did on Edwards' kind of spiritual practices, and maybe something like that. But as I read around, one of the things that struck me is there was a real gap in the literature at that point. As I looked around, I recognized if I'm going to talk about sanctification in Edwards or something like it, I've got to rest on the work of someone else. I've got to rest on someone who's talked about his theological method, that's talked about the doctrine of God, that's really given a really cohesive vision of what does it look like to have this overview of Edwards' understanding of cosmology and creation, all these kinds of things that kind of order and help us locate his doctrine of sanctification. And at least at that point, and a lot's changed since then, but at that point, I was looking around it, and I didn't really see a distinctively reformed read of Edwards and a distinctively theological read. There's a handful. Steve Holmes' work was a very key book for me at a time where Holmes recognized that Edwards is a reformed theologian. He's functioning like one of the high orthodox theologians of the Reformed period, but he's doing it uniquely. He's got a different philosophical context. He's a little more creative. Some of George's comments, he's bringing beauty in as a foundational concept. And these things, not only kind of awoke me to, wow, there's a lot here, I'm really interested in this. But I think even as a systematic theologian looking at our own context, and while a lot of what Edwards was grabbing onto and doing so well, it is precisely what moment we're at again in history, where we're longing for theology that's richly spiritual, that is profoundly analytic at points, is kind of integrated with aesthetics in a real way, kind of recognizes the churchly task of theology. All of these are very kind of forefront questions right now in theology, and I recognize very quickly that, wow, Edwards he's done this. And so for me, he really became a model of what might it look like to be a systematic theologian in a very traditional sense. That allows me to, I'm a bit of a generalist, so it allows me to play around in his philosophy and his spirituality and these other areas. And so it's even now, this is one of the reasons I kind of keep reading Edwards.
What do you see as the obstacles for people, if people are interested in getting into Edwards,
Yeah.
and you've done a good bit of writing for a general audience.
Yeah.
What do you see as the main obstacles for people to really get into Edwards and find this, what we've all found, that here's someone who is so rich that you can really spend years studying and still think, well, there's a lot more
that's
there,
right.
or you can go back to and say, if you want to really understand topic X, go to Edwards.
Yeah. I mean, as we know, he's not the easiest guy to read.
Yeah.
I mean, there's times when he is just difficult to. You really feel yourself having to kind of trudge through.
Yeah,
what does he
when
say?
people ask me, and the only thing I say, read The Divine and Supernatural Light. That's accessible.
Yeah, that's good.
And short, and some of the parts of Charity and Its Fruits are very easy, but then Edwards can be so exhaustive in the way he does things. So you have to read in a different tempo than because sometimes it takes a really long time to say something, but he'll say it very precisely once he does it.
I wonder, George, with your work, I particularly think of your shorter work when you compare Edwards to Ben Franklin and kind of you're going to work. I found that to be so helpful because I feel like as an American, we just have Franklin in our consciousness in a way we don't have Edwards, and yet that wasn't always the case. And I think that there's this Edwardsian inclination to the American experience, and particularly I think the evangelical experience, that if people knew, I think would actually help them kind of seek out, like, who's this figure that's been influenced? You maybe
I thought that people, to realize that Edwards and Franklin are very close contemporaries, both brought up in New England with very strong Reformed backgrounds, and it's part of the American story for religious groups in America that some people go in the secular direction and other people amplify their religious heritage, and that's a constant contrast. So Franklin is sort of the archetypical American trust yourself, the kind of thing that Emerson picks up later, whereas Edwards is saying exactly the opposite. And when he talks about humility, for instance, trust God and don't trust yourself too much. You trust yourself only to the extent that you've trusted God, and that's fits very much in the with the American tradition, but it puts religion rather than humans God rather than humans at the center of things.
You know, one of the things that's really struck me about Edwards, particularly just in light of our own context, is that point. And, you know, with my seminary students even, I see a degree of just exhaustion about how much that they expect of themselves to achieve in their lives. That I've got to create a self in my own power to thrive at life. That you know, they grew up with parents that lied to them by telling them you could do anything you set your mind to, which of course we know is false. There's most things we can't do that we set our mind to, and yet they kind of think, no, I can do this, and they've got all these tools and technology that they can kind of wield to try to create a self that's powerful in this world. And for Edwards, I think he seemed to meditate on what Paul says in Colossians 3, that your life is hidden with Christ in God. And that if you actually discover yourself there, and if you allow God to kind of define the truth of yourself, that this actually leads to freedom. It isn't, we intuit it as moderns as a kind of binding, as this will take away freedom. I think for Edwards, it just kind of functioned in the very opposite sort of direction, that love and receiving this kind of love and recognizing my life in God as an act of love is actually what allows you to be fully human in a profound sense.
Right, that this is what you're meant to be, and to see that the universe is essentially relational. If one thing Edwards is very strong on is that there's a person at the center of reality, and that the most important questions are personal relation. What's your relationship to that person, and then to the other person's in reality, and that's the kind of way we ought to be understanding ourselves. But we're in a culture that encourages independence from community and other persons, and thinking of yourself first, and thinking of yourself as a very important person. I read something, I think in David Brooks, who said that today, like 80% of young people say, I'm a very important person, where back in the 1950s it was something like 10%.
Yeah, sure.
So our culture just encourages that, what you talked about, you can do anything you want. And so Edwards is very good at saying things are essentially relational, and it's giving up yourself, but it's also more essentially fulfilling of your potentiality.
Yeah.
He sort of he reorients us then,
Yeah.
in a sense. He makes us see reality in a slightly different way by turning it on its axis, perhaps, from the way that we tend to view things as moderns, to bring us back to a much more God-centered and God-infused way of contemplating.
Right, that if you see
reality
God
itself.
at the center of reality, then you see you're on the periphery along with everybody else, and that's a much more healthy relationship to others, and is the essence, or the basis for true charity toward other people.
Right.
That you
Right.
see them, their interests as just as good as important as yours.
Yeah. I think that is a really important aspect of Edwards' appeal for me. Precisely what you're getting at there, George, that he kind of reconnects us to themes that today we seem to have lost or subverted in various sorts of ways. But I think also, like many great thinkers, Edwards has an appeal precisely because he has this kind of grand vision that speaks into a number of different contexts, right? It speaks into the church, it speaks into the way we conceive of the church, the way we conceive ourselves in relation to others, as you've just been saying. He speaks to certain sorts of intellectual communities, theological community, the philosophical community, and the historical community, and others besides literature and semiotics and goodness knows what else. But also he has this unusual position, it seems to me, for a theologian. A lot of theologians, at least these days, they tend to pursue their ivory tower academic theology. They churn out their books and they teach in their lecture halls. But the connection that their work has with the church is very indirect. There's a kind of trickle-down effect by means of their students, but it's very indirect. So someone like Karl Barth, for example, great theologian, but the actual effect of his church dogmatics is a kind of trickle-down effect, it seems to me, in many respects. Whereas Edwards is unusual in that he's a churchman all his life, and also he's one of the leaders of the Great Awakening. So he is intimately involved with the life of the church. He's not sort of one step removed, sitting in his... he is in his study a lot, right? But there's a way in which his theology isn't merely a theology of the head, but a theology of the heart, and he's really interested in these sorts of things. And one of the things that I really appreciated about your big biography when I read it was that it really got at that, and it managed to make that sort of world that's kind of removed from us now come alive. So there's something about that with respect to Edwards, isn't there? That he speaks beyond our time and place into different sorts of cultures and contexts as a consequence of the different aspects of his thought that seem to resonate.
Well, it speaks to the need for the educated pastor who the Tim Keller sort of person who's a great Edwards fan, but is a communicator and knows how to translate that, and that's a sort of model that one would hope we get back to. And Edwards lived in a time when it was typical that the pastor would be the best educated person in the community, and that remained the case in some communities for a long time, but that has become more rarely the case. So it's I think a model to think about. You're both involved in theological education for the pastor, or even for the person who might think, oh, I want to go into academia. Well, maybe you need to go into the pastor. Take your talents into the pastoral ministry too.
Oliver, I wonder with some of your interests and in light of what you just said about Edwards as a kind of churchly theologian, and I do wonder, and we're good friends, so I keep up on your work quite a lot, obviously, and we work together. But I have wondered. I've never told you this, but I have wondered: is this the last Edwards piece? Like, if you, are you? And you always surprise me by something you didn't tell me about that comes out, and I'm like, when did this come out? Why do you keep on doing Edwards?
It's a good question. I keep asking myself that. I never intended to keep doing Edwards. I think when I started out, I did my doctoral dissertation on Edwards, but then immediately turned to other things, partly because I wanted to have a sort of broader portfolio of things that it just turns out I was interested in other things as well. But I've kind of circled back to Edwards over the years, and each time I try to get away from Edwards, it kind of draws me back in. So there's a sort of gravitational pull there, I think. But that ties into the stuff we've just been talking about in a way. I think what keeps me coming back to Edwards is precisely that he is this sort of multifaceted thinker. He thinks, he's like an Augustine, or he's like a Barth, or he's like a Calvin. He has this kind of view of the whole of reality. And he has this sort of complete vision. And that's very attractive and it's very compelling. And the vision that he has, as we've already been saying, it's got these different sort of aspects. There's the aesthetic aspect about the beauty of God and God's beauty reflecting the created order, and how we're called to be a community that participates in the life of God and is made beautiful through being united to Christ through the power of the Spirit. And all of this sort of language, he's kind of taking very traditional theological concepts and kind of reconceiving them in various ways and putting them together in a slightly different combination that makes it really fascinating to encounter and deal with Edwards. And I think for me, Edwards is one of those thinkers. I think often theologians, they school themselves with respect to a particular thinker. They'll have a kind of period where they apprentice themselves to the work of a great thinker of the past, whoever that is. It might be Schleiermacher, it might be Barth, it might be Calvin, it might be Luther, it might be Thomas Aquinas or Anselm of Canterbury, whoever it is. Someone whose work you get to know and helps you to kind of show up on your own thinking. And for me, Edwards has been very much that sort of person. That he's helped me to... I don't always end up agreeing with Edwards. I think some of his views are crazy. But what he helps me to see is where the issues lie, where he might have gone wrong, that will help me take a slightly different route, those sorts of things. Yeah. So I think he's kind of fascinating, kind of irritating and fascinating,
Yeah, I think you can take the attitude, you can learn from him, even though there's going to be some things where you just disagree with him, but you're always have a sense that you're encountering someone out of the ordinary.
Yeah, totally.
Both in brilliance of intellect and intensity of spirituality.
Yeah.
To put those two things together, and as you say, a practical person who's running a big congregation, who's a pastor of a big congregation, oversees a spectacular revival in the congregation, part of the Great Awakening, and in correspondence with people in the English-speaking world about all sorts of things. Doing all this at once, there's going to, even though there's some things you might think he goes too far on, nonetheless, you can almost any topic you can count on learning something.
Exactly. Yeah.
That actually, the part of Edwards that I think I've come to love the most over the years, because I'm similar to you, I never thought I was going to keep on publishing on Edwards. And I kind of thought, well, when he stops teaching me, I'll just lay him down.
Yeah.
And I can't lay him down because every time I want to think about something, I find that he has such a profound way of engaging it.
Totally.
But it's even when I come to a point where I'm like, I just can't follow you here, that he's always so instructive.
Yeah.
I learned so much even in his mistakes. I think it's a real sign of a great theologian that no matter what the issue is, no matter what, if you agree with them or not, they're helping you think theologically about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they're kind of unveiling there's a logic to this that we must follow. So Oliver and I have just finished a book on Edwards, introducing his thought as a whole. And in the last chapter, I really wanted to give a reflection on what might it look like to be Edwardsian today. And that meant coming face to face with some of these things that I just can't follow him here. And most of it, some of this kind of what we now think of as very radical philosophy, that God is recreating the world every moment, that there's no such thing as matter, but everything is ideal. And then there's philosophers that hold these things. But in my mind, I'm like, this is radical. But as I sat with it and thought, well, what was Edwards against at this point in the Enlightenment? What's going on in the world? Who are the people he's worried about? Over and over and over again, I see Edwards trying to qualify his statements. When he says God does all and we do all, he's doing that within a framework that is heavily deterministic, but he doesn't want it to be reduced down to such a way that creatures don't have any real freedom. He's trying to carve out space in a very mechanized world that he's been handed for creatures to live and thrive. And I think for so long, Edwards has been painted with a very broad brush. He's such an easy thinker to reduce. It's so easy to take something he said, or to take some instinct he has, or to just read Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God and just assume from there. And what I continually find is that there is such nuance, and he's so careful. And he, even I think in his mistakes, he's brilliantly recognizing the tension in his own thought and trying to kind of constructively consider ways that, how can I think through this issue faithfully that'll kind of carve out the view of reality I think Scripture gives us.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's an old saying by the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer that an argument isn't like a cab. You can't pay it off when you've gone as far as you want to go. An argument carries on irrespective of whether you want it to go to its conclusion or not. One of the things I think is so compelling about Edwards is that he had seen the conclusions that his various arguments were taking him in the various aspects of his thought and embraced them, even if they seem to us today to be somewhat extreme or counterintuitive. But he's one of these people that doesn't want to pay the cab off. He's willing to embrace the conclusion. And in a way, I think that's part of his appeal, that he's someone who is unafraid to embrace some of the apparently strange conclusions to which his kind of intuitions, his theological intuitions, drive him. For someone who thinks of everything in sort of in the light of God and His glory and all that kind of stuff. And the other thing related to what you just said, Kyle, is that when I started reading Edwards and kept coming back to Edwards, it's almost like he finds it impossible to write something boring on a theological topic. Now, whatever topic you want to think about, if you go and read what Edwards has to say, somehow he has a way of recasting how we think about that topic in such a manner that the result is absolutely fascinating. Even if you think it's crazy, it's kind of fascinating. And you want to sort of read it and figure out what he's got to say. And I'm sad to say that that's not always the case with every theologian. So often you're reading theology and you think, oh, this is a bit of a drag. But here's someone who's really careful about how he passes out things and has a kind of unique perspective on a number of these different issues. I mean, I wonder sometimes whether the way in which he was such an original thinker is connected to the place in which he worked and the time at which he worked, sort of on the frontiers of what was then Western civilization in the 18th century. That perhaps the context in which he was formed actually made him into that kind of thinker, whereas perhaps if he'd lived in one of the centres of the early Enlightenment, like Paris or London or Edinburgh or somewhere like that.
Yes, I think that one of the reasons for his creativity is that he lived at the intersection of two really attractive worlds, that he was brought up in a very strongly Puritan culture. His father's Puritan minister, he's saturated in Reformed theology, and then he's also totally fascinated by what we call the Enlightenment, and he reads everything he can on what's going on, and seeing those two things in contrast to each other, he has a lot of questions to ask. How do they fit? And he sees I think the challenge of the Enlightenment is Kyle was suggesting that he provides an alternative to the direction that modernity is going, which is the Enlightenment, as in deism, distances God from creation. And people begin to get a sort of dualist view that, well, they're religious, but then there's the real world where things just work on sort of a mechanical basis. And that would be sort of the Benjamin Franklin view. Whereas Edwards is saying, no, if you're talking about God at all, God has to be at the center of things. You can't just say, well, God has something to do with morality. If God has something to do with it, God has everything to do with it. And that's a terrific insight that then he explores in great detail. And even if you don't agree with every detail, the insight is essential.
It reminds me, when you were talking earlier, this very point of Edwards' pastoral vocation in the midst of, I think some of us, and I've done this at times, I've kind of wished, man, why didn't he go to the academy sooner? Why couldn't he have written a systematic theology? And I think we kind of forget that actually his greatness is tied to the kind of work he did. It's like, Edwards, why is he giving himself to religious affections? Why is he editing Brainerd's diary? And Edwards is kind of, in a sense, forcing himself to be very present to a certain time and place. Again, as theologians, it's very easy as first not to be, right? We can kind of float above. We can just stay kind of removed from the actual present moment and simply talk doctrine or talk philosophical, theological ideas. And while Edwards is doing that, he's always regrounding it. And I think it's such a profound feature of his legacy.
And willing to be a missionary to the Indians.
Yeah.
Take a family of...
That's right,
of how many children. And onto the very dangerous frontier, that he's not just a theoretical person.
Yeah. I mean, you imagine he certainly would have been able to go to the academy, and instead he's constantly giving himself to the church, to pastoral ministry, to missions, these other kind of endeavors. And there seems to be in Edwards, at least, and maybe I'm reading this into him a bit, but I sense this piece of him where he kind of recognizes, for him to do what he really wants to give himself to, the proper location of that's the church. And it's such a central feature of his. I think he gives us one of the greatest works on discerning the Spirit in the tradition that can come out of that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how Edwards bequeaths to his intellectual heirs in the 19th century and beyond, and particularly to evangelicalism as it developed over that period of time, a number of key works that then are kind of seeds from which you see further fruit going in different directions down the line. I mean, the religious affections and his work on the revivals is one such. The Brainerd Diary and its effect on the missionary movement in the 19th century, and on this whole trajectory of kind of Protestant hagiography is another one. And then, you might think of his work, his doctrinal work on original sin, or his philosophical work on freedom of the will. These are still theological issues with which we have to wrestle today. And although he's not the only thinker who's thought about those things, of course, nevertheless, I think within evangelicalism, there's a sense in which those works by Edwards are a kind of high watermark to which people come back time and time again as they re-engage in each generation. What does it mean for us to live out our lives in the presence of God? In what sense are we free? How does original sin affect how we live today? How can I experience God? And all these sorts of things are in many ways traceable to some of his key works. And they're the fruit, precisely as you're saying, they're the fruit of someone who is engaged with the church on a daily basis, who's spending most of his time writing sermons and dealing with pastoral problems and stuff like that, and yet somehow finds time to work on these great things as well. It's a kind of amazing.
Well, and also, as Kyle has written about, he has all these contemplative practices, and just he's going out and contemplating and being enthralled by a sense of God's of God's presence, and there's something very attractive to that if you're there in the midst of nature and you're seeing the beauty of nature, and then you see that as God communicating, then it's not just you're seeing something that happens to be beautiful, but this is beauty that has a larger dimension to it, or personal dimension to it. It's it's another angle of his many-sidedness that it's almost everything he's involved in. There's a recent book on his emphasis on charity, and he practiced secret charity and is promoting. I mean, he's not just talking about good works, but he's actually trying to get people to do it. So he's so many dimensions.
Well, I think it's the balance of all those things that's so incredible to me, at least, where he's so intellectually brilliant, he's so philosophically brilliant. You could just imagine a person that could get so lost in the ideas of the thing.
Right.
And yet for Edwards, God is just so present. I mean, he really is living in a world that is just saturated with divine realities. And that kind of contemplative bent of Edwards, that he doesn't just stay in his study, but he goes and he kind of ventures into the woods. You get a sense in Edwards where he longs to just be out in nature, where he can kind of bathe in God's presence.
Right, and hear God speaking.
That's right, yeah.
That heavens declare the glory.
That's right.
This is not a theoretical thing for him.
Yeah, I think of very few. I mean, Augustine's the obvious one that comes to mind of a figure who's able to have that kind of creative genius that's wrapped up in someone who's so able to kind of recognize God's imminent presence to them then there in a real sense.
I know that in their recent massive tome on Edwards' theology, Michael McClymond and Jerry McDermott make the point that Edwards may be the theologian for the 21st century because as we've been saying in our conversation, he's able to speak both to the Harvard historian and to the Pentecostal pastor in Brazil. And there just aren't very many theologians in the Christian tradition who have that range in terms of people sitting down and reading their work and getting something out of it and utilizing their work in the sorts of things that they do. So I'd be interested to talk about the way in which Edwards' legacy is being reappropriated today, and what that, as McClymond and McDermott say, what that might mean for us going forward, not just in terms of Edwards' scholarship, but in terms of Edwards' impact beyond the scholarly world and into the life of the church.
Yeah, one of the most encouraging things to me about Edwards' studies, at least, is that when I started out, not all that long ago, reading Edwards, you could count on one hand the amount of constructive theologians that were really presently working with Edwards' thought. And by and large, what's interesting about Edwards' legacy, for all the reasons we've shared, is that it has been a little more, at least in the last 50 years, it's been pastors who have grabbed onto Edwards. Right. And I think now we're at a moment where people are recognizing, wow, in Edwards there is a real brilliance. There is something that we can really grab onto to think constructively about doctrine. I think right now there's two different trajectories. One trajectory wants to read Edwards almost as ecumenical. And I actually think there's something right about that instinct, but I think the instinct is actually wrong in terms of how it gets played out. I think Edwards is ecumenical because he's great, and because he's a great Reformed theologian. And Reformed thought has always been Catholic in its universal thought. And it's in his creative genius from within a very specific tradition. Not that he's somehow traditionless. I mean, there's this one way of reading Edwards, that he had no intellectual father, and so he's not actually Reformed. He's kind of this hybrid thing. I think that's a very wrong-headed way to read Edwards. Edwards is so richly Reformed and yet creative that he really does allow us to never simply just take the tradition because of the tradition said it, but to take the instincts of the tradition and to really think well about those. I mean, one of the things that struck me is, the Westminster Confession, when it's talking about justification, says that faith is the instrument by which we receive justification. And Edwards says no. He signed Westminster, he signed on, and yet he says, there's a mistake here that's very problematic. It's very tiny. It might even appear semantic, but for Edwards it wasn't. He said, faith is the instrument by which we receive Christ. And I think Edwards recognized that by making justification the kind of telos of faith, that justification was the center now of all of our salvation. Edwards said, no, Christ is the center. Mm-hmm. And it's that receiving the tradition, living within it, but then really thinking through, how do we take this on and what does it mean to be faithful theologically to this, that allows his creative genius really to kind of come alive.
Yeah.
And so I think we need to do that work to really sit. So my own work, as you both know, is a lot of where this has led me is Edwards' view of theosis. And so immediately we tend to think, well, maybe this is Eastern Orthodox. Well, again, it's what does a Reformed doctrine of theosis look like? I think that's our starting point. And then we begin to think, because of the sheer greatness of his thought, how might this allow us to have conversations across these bounds to say, wow, no one ever kind of has noticed that the Reformed have a really robust doctrine of theosis. Maybe we should talk about that. And so I think there is a way to go about bringing Edwards into constructive theology that we have to take seriously, that he is a richly Reformed theologian, without losing how creative and brilliant his thought really was.
Yeah, absolutely. George, you've written a lot about evangelicalism and its development, particularly in the 19th and 20th century. I mean, I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about the way in which you think Edwards might be a catalyst for changes in evangelical thought going forward. Do you think he might be a useful interlocutor for evangelical theologians as they try to, as it were, pass on the faith that's been passed on to them in the 21st century? Are there ways in which what he says connects deeply with things that are happening in evangelicalism today and that sort of thing?
Yes, it's encouraging that Edwards there's been such a revival of interest in Edwards, and I think it's related to him being such an evangelical that by any standard he passes as a genuine evangelical, but he also is evangelicals have a reputation, not wholly undeserved, for being anti-intellectual, and he's such a robust theology and even though he's sometimes a polemicist, he's
That's generous.
I think there are a lot of at least positive directions that you can take that for enriching various evangelical traditions, and someone said Pentecostal or Reform, that is not a sectarian kind of thing. I think that's related to the fact that it's Reformed, but it's Augustinian, and that means it intersects with just about every tradition. So there's some Catholic theologians have found things in Edwards to benefit from, and so I think that's true for each sort of evangelical to find a fresh dynamic there that may have been. I think one of the things that happened in the 20th century, obviously, was that in the zeal to fight against the modernist theologies, that evangelicalism often became rather formulaic, and Edwards is a good way of broadening out. One of the ways to broaden out from that.
Yeah. Oliver, I wonder, it'd be interesting, I'd be curious to kind of hear a similar question for you, but specifically, you're one of the leading writers in analytic theology. You're certainly one of the leading guys on Edwards' philosophy, which is, of course, a very kind of hard nest to pull apart. Do you see areas, how is Edwards, in a sense, a model of this? What do you really have to teach these folks, and even in your own work? How do you see this constructively kind of moving forward?
Well, I think this connects to our earlier point about Edwards as a theologian, not just a theologian of the church, but a churchman who's also a theologian or something like that, right? Yeah. A pastor theologian in a very rich sense. And I guess increasingly my concern is to ensure that we have joined up theology, theology that joins up to the life of the church and that makes a contribution to the life of the church and that can affect the way we do church in practical ways. And I think Edwards is a real model for doing that. And so not only just his approach to theology is something that I think is conducive and other analytic theologians have found conducive. It's not just his kind of careful parsing and logical bent of mind and those sorts of things, but it's the way in which the kind of deep themes that inform his thought are fundamentally ecclesiastical in nature. He's wanting to make sure that the church is made fruitful in order that it can carry out the work that it's been given. He looks to see the church being formed into the image of Christ so that it can become his bride in the eschaton and all those sorts of things. So I think Edwards is a fruitful dialogue partner for a range of different theologians coming to this task, and analytic theologians can certainly benefit, I think, from looking to Edwards as someone whose work going forward is deeply engaged with the life and the fruitfulness of the church.